Hello. Today we will be talking to a poet about poetry, of course, and its many forms. Please stay tuned.
Welcome to The Better Part, a program that encompasses a diverse spectrum of topics important to our community, which we hope will both inform and entertain you. We invite you to sit back and enjoy the program.
Our guest today is Cupertino Poet Laureate David Denny. He is a graduate of Long Beach University and did his master's work at the University of Oregon. David has been an instructor at De Anza College for 25 years and has been writing and publishing poetry for the last 35 years. And he is about to have one of his books published, which we'll be talking about later in the show. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
How did you get started in writing and teaching poetry?
Well, the writing started way before the teaching. I've always been interested in writing and drama and its various forms. But as for poetry in particular, that started in high school. I just started taking classes and getting interested and inspired by various teachers. And in one of these classes, the yearbook staff came in and said, "We have a project. We would like all of the students in your poetry class to write a poem, and if they pass muster, we'll print them in the annual for that year." So that gave us all a little bit of motivation. The theme, as I recall, was doors. So you had to write a poem about doors. And I remember reading at that time an old story in which, based on Alice in Wonderland, in which the character goes through succeedingly smaller doors. And I thought that was a good image to start with, so I wrote a poem about doors, submitted it, forgot about it. The end of the year came around, and they really featured my poem for some reason in the annual. And a lot of feedback came in the following weeks from people I'd never known before on campus. And that positive reinforcement, I think, got me hooked.
So you first published in high school?
In high school, that's right. Yep,
Oh.
in our high school annual.
And they well accepted?
Very well accepted. Everybody seemed to like it, and that encouragement kind of prompted me.
I'm sure it
And
would.
then in college, I got more serious about it, and had some great professors that really inspired me and taught me a lot about poetry, and that got me hooked.
Tell us about your teaching at De Anza College and what do you basically cover? I know you teach more than poetry. And how do the students accept poetry?
There's a range of responses to poetry. It's not the most popular art form these days. It was way back when. But nowadays, there is a kind of resurgent interest in poetry. So that I find young people especially are interested not only in writing poems and sharing their ideas and their emotions in them, but also in studying poetry. So we get a largely positive feedback on it. I teach a range of classes. One of them is poetry writing. And I'm just finishing up a unit on that this quarter. And I've got about 15 really serious young poets in that class. And in the other courses we teach, sometimes I'll throw a book of poems in there as part of the reading material for it, just to expose them to it. And there the readings are a little more mixed.
What type of student do you normally get for a poetry class, or is it just all over the place?
It really is all over the place. There's a big range, age range of experience, different reasons that people end up coming into a poetry class. It's not, however, a typical writing class. I think people have special feelings about poetry. They sense that poems are distillations of emotional states. Somehow we treat poetry a little bit differently than we do other types of writing. So I tend to get slightly more serious students who come into that class, and some with some familiarity with the art form before they get there.
Okay, and to take this one step further, how does the general public accept poetry?
Well, there's a big range, again. Some people just ignore the stuff, although I don't think they're really ignoring it, because most of us get our poetry fix through songs and music and the lyrics that we all memorize, our favorite songs and so forth. And then there's a smaller group of people who are devotees of the art form. They are really interested in poetry. It's a small and unfortunately shrinking number there. But there is also a broader awareness of poetry these days with positions, public positions like mine of Poet Laureate, where people are saying, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? There's something here that I've maybe missed. So I think there's a rising interest in poetry.
Okay, and one of the things I've read, you said, everyone has a poem inside them that just needs to be unlocked. Now, how do I unlock my poem?
Well, I think that people tend to write poetry under a couple of different conditions. One is they sense that they can do something in language that they can't do in any other form. And so a poem comes with an awareness that language is the vehicle for what they're feeling. And then usually that's combined with some kind of pressure, some event or some insight that somebody has that links them to some larger issue. And those two things come together, people feel like they want to write a poem. So it's language and a little bit of pressure pressing down on them to put their thoughts and feelings in language. I remember as a teenager when my grandmother died, which came as a great shock to me. No one in our family had passed away before. Mm-hmm. One of my first responses was to sit at my little homework desk in my room and write out my earliest memories of my grandmother. So somehow I had a sense that if I wrote this out, it would maybe make sense of what was happening, and I could condense my emotions in some way. And I think that's the impulse for poetry.
Okay, you have this wonderful title of Poet Laureate, and we have a big sign behind us which says Poet Laureate. What is a Poet Laureate, and where did the whole concept come from?
Well, it goes all the way back to ancient Greece. As you know, athletes in the ancient world were very highly lauded, and what you would win instead of a ribbon or a trophy if you won an athletic contest is a laurel wreath, and that would be placed upon your head as a sign of honor. It would be conferred by judges, but the laurel wreath symbolized that the entire community was behind that person and acknowledged them as the winner of that athletic event. And so that carried over into poetry. Some of the earliest and best poets are from ancient Greece. They mostly wrote dramatic poems. We call them Greek tragedies. And they actually used to have contests in those days, and the winner was crowned with a laurel wreath. So throughout history, the idea of crowning a poet is a sort of an honorary way of saying this person speaks for us or on behalf of us in a way that maybe we can't or haven't yet. So in modern times, this idea of the laureate got associated in the royal families, and especially in England, where the poet laureate was a distinguished, usually elderly poet, somebody like William Butler Yeats, who had been writing their whole life, devoting their life to the art. And the royal family would then bestow that honor of laureate upon them. So Yeats himself was the poet laureate for many years in England. Now the thing about that position was it had a political side to it. So the laureate was compelled, whenever things happened, if a baby was born in the royal family, the laureate would then write a poem celebrating that birth, or a death, or a coronation. If anything happened related to the government, the laureate was the spokesperson. We have less of that in the modern world, but I think I was chosen by Cupertino because so many of my poems take place in Cupertino and describe the surroundings and our community, our various businesses and things like that. So the laureate is an honorary position, but it's also one that I think represents the community.
Well, it sounds like in the old ages it was basically the royalty and people who were literate, and not that many people were literate in those days, correct?
That's right.
It was most likely stuff that was passed around at court and stuff like that.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I do remember at your, when they announced you as a poet laureate, they put a laurel wreath on your head.
They did, they did. Yeah. The ritual embarrassment, we called that.
The ritual embarrassment. Okay, here we go now. This is the real question here is, I don't understand poetry. I look at the New Yorker, which we have a cover of back here, and I wonder why some of these things are called poems. I mean, I don't understand, they don't rhyme, and I understand the line breaks, and in some cases I don't even understand what they're talking about. Yeah. But I obviously am missing something. How How can you explain a little bit to me as what is poetry and how can I read stuff like that, which the New Yorker most likely has the better poetry, maybe.
We do attract some of our better poets,
Yeah.
it's true.
What is poetry?
There are so many definitions of it nowadays that it's poetry is whatever you like it to be, in a sense. It really is that wide open. However, the people that we acknowledge as poets are people who have this talent with language to distill either emotional states or stories that resonate with other people. But part of what you're referring to with the difficulty is during the modern era, poets became specialists. And very often they produced very dense, difficult poems. I'm thinking, for example, of Wallace Stevens or Marianne Moore, even somebody like T.S. Eliot, whose name is very familiar, but whose poems are really poems to be studied in school. They're so dense in their meaning and their linguistic structures. So there are poems like that, and you're right, a lot of them have, through the years, ended up in the New Yorker, and folks like you and I have opened the New Yorker and said, what is this about?
I understand the cartoons, but I don't understand.
Exactly, and often the cartoons,
poems.
I have to say, are a little bit better than some of the poetry in there. But there are other poems that are aimed at general audiences. They're a little more easy to grasp. One of the poets that I really love of recent times, he was a national poet laureate for us a few years back, is Billy Collins, whose task was to bring humor back into poetry. That had just gotten so serious in the post-war era that his idea was that we should really write our poems for a general audience, for the average person to read.
But again, the question, how come some of it doesn't rhyme?
Well, rhyme is something that was very popular for a certain amount of time in English, but English is called a rhyme-poor language. It's actually very difficult to rhyme in English, unless it's the old conventional moon and June sort of rhymes that we're all familiar with. We can do those pretty well. Mm-hmm. But there came a period after World War II in which poets largely decided that rhyme had been tapped out. There was so much of it and it was so hard to do in English that they would try to write in free verse and not use rhyming structures anymore. And that became really popular until about the 70s and 80s when rhyme came back into fashion. So it's something that kind of comes in and out of fashion as you go through time.
Is there structure in free verse? Does it follow some type of a rhythmic pattern or something?
There is a structure, but often it's an invented structure. So rhyming poems, English sonnets, for example, used to have very complicated nesting structures where the rhymes had to come at the end of certain lines and in certain places in the poem, and the reader or the listener expected to hear those sounds, and hearing those sounds was part of the joy of the poem. And what happened in the modern era is poets like E. Cummings and others threw that book out and said, I'm going to play by my own rules. And instead of making a poem fit into a particular pattern, they made the pattern up according to the content. So for E. Cummings, for example, he would write a poem about a leaf falling. And so on the page you would see the letters kind of snaking down the page as if it were a leaf falling from a tree. Okay. And so for him the form was to match the function of the poem to its content.
So they're basically painting with words?
I think that's part of it, yeah. It was just a way of reinventing poetry.
Okay, are there any other poet laureates in the area?
There are. Parthenia Hicks is our poet laureate of Los Gatos. Mm-hmm. And then the county has a poet laureate. Her name is Sally Ashton. Mm-hmm. And she's undertaken a project called the Favorite Poems Project. And she's soon to undertake a wonderful idea, I think, in which she is going to put poetry on buses and trams all around Santa Clara Valley. It's called Poetry in Motion, and she's soon to get this going. When this program airs, it'll probably be well into process.
Oh, that would be a fun project.
Yeah.
So is it true that you sit in coffee shops and write poems?
Well, that's true. You know, I teach at De Anza College, and within walking distance are a couple of pretty good coffee shops. I tend to favor Pete's. It's a little bit quieter and the music is nicer. Mm-hmm. And so very often after classes in the afternoon, I'll grab my notebook and another book and walk on over to Pete's and have a seat in the corner. And I've composed many poems just sitting in there listening to the music and having some time with my thoughts, maybe doing a little bit of reading as well.
Did you bring a sample?
I did. I brought a poem that I wrote in Pete's, and if you go into the Pete's coffee shop in Cupertino on Stevens Creek Boulevard, this poem is now posted up in there for everyone to see as they're waiting for their coffee to brew.
Okay.
So this was just written as I was sitting looking out the window one day. It was a winter's afternoon. It just started to get dark. So this is called 5 p.m. Cupertino. I'm sitting in Pete's with my usual cappuccino reading. I stop for a sip, trace the rim of the cup with my finger, look out the window at Stevens Creek Boulevard. Across the street, cars are pulling in and out of the Whole Foods parking lot. The construction workers who were tearing up the road when I arrived have collected their orange cones and gone home, leaving their gashes in the asphalt covered with large metal rectangles. The sun is making its final effort to illuminate the world for another day. The foothills above town are ready for Cézanne to come along and capture the geometry of dusk. Suddenly, light catches the trees along the sidewalk for a moment. Though the top branches are bare, a few amber leaves, still clinging to lower branches, shimmer. I take another sip, grateful for the way the milk and the espresso both calm and excite the nervous system. With my glasses off, the cars resemble logs being carried by a river current, and the leaves look like fuzzy yellow stars, and the foothills, I'll leave the foothills to my friend Cézanne.
Very nice. So you just sit in coffee shops, and how long does it take you to come up with something
Well,
like
sometimes quite a while. That one was written out initially fairly quickly. I was just describing what I had seen, but it took several weeks after that to polish the lines and kind of play with the rhythms and the images and get them in the right order. And then I like poems to look nice and neat and tidy on the page, so I'll often put them into little stanza structures. That one's in 3-line stanzas, which just kind of guides the reader down the page and helps them read it the way that I would read it.
Okay. In cleaning out my attic for this show, I came across a publication which is back here on the rack, which is a dog-eared copy of a publication from the Hobo Press. And let me just read the title, because it's 200 popular recitation stories and poems of radio, screen, and stage fame, the most wonderful collection ever written by old and new masters, published by Otis O. Rogers, the boomer poet, and it's published by the Hobo News. And it has classics in it. There are too many to mention, but I just marked a few. Casey Jones and The Cremation of Sam McGee.
Great title.
If you want to have some fun, you go to Google, you look up The Cremation of Sam McGee, and stop at Johnny Cash and just listen to it. So many of these poems are so much better when somebody is reading them and putting their voice and their feelings into it.
Yeah, that's important, isn't it? It's almost like the poem is a script and the reader is the actor who brings the emotional subtext to it.
Now, where did they use all these recitations? There's 200 there, which are, most of them are classic, and some are Shakespeare and everything, but where did they use these type of poems?
In any popular setting, a bar room, a library, people's living rooms. Some of these poems were recited during the vaudeville days. They were insanely popular during the period of Western expansion, where an actor would come to town and part of his performance was the recitation. He would give one or two very serious poems, often about something that had happened in the nation recently. The death of Lincoln, for example, is one that prompted a lot of different recitations. And then they might have a break and then do an evening performance of a Shakespeare play or something like that. So these publications, and this is the title on this is incredible, very as modest as it is, were just all over the country back in the day. We also have different popular publications, not too dissimilar from that, with different popular poems like rap lyrics and things like that today.
And how do rap lyrics fit into poetry?
Well, they're one of those very popular subsets, I think, of poetry. You know, poetry really is anything that you call a poem.
Mm-hmm.
And the great thing about rap lyricists is that because some of the modern poets had left rhythm and rhyme as structures, the rap artists went back and recaptured those, put them in an urban environment, made them very heavy on the rhythm and the rhyme, and really brought that back into the popular realm.
How about some of our other popular songwriters? You know, Paul McCartney, John Lennon, Brian Wilson, Bob Dylan, Paul Simon, Woody Guthrie. We don't seem to think that our songs are a form of poetry.
But they really are, especially those guys that you named. They're all great poets. And in fact, nowadays, in many of the school anthologies, you'll see popular lyrics by the Beatles and Paul Simon and Bob Dylan. So I think song lyrics are sometimes terrific poems in themselves.
Okay, let's talk about lighter poetry. My favorites, not that I have a great deal of favorite poets, but in the light area is Les Barker, who's an English poet who's crazy. He wrote a poem about, I think it's I named my dog Fetch. And then everybody knows Ogden Nash. And
Ogden Nash.
You've written some lighter poetry, haven't you?
I have, following Billy Collins, whose goal it was at one point to bring humor back into poetry. I think that's an important part of poetry. We don't want to take ourselves too seriously.
Right.
There are certainly serious poems
Yes.
that need to be written, but also life is fun sometimes, and some of the joyful moments of life need to be shown in verse too. So I brought in a little poem, which is, I've written a series of these. I call these flights of fancy. And so very often I will just make something up, just as a story writer might make up a little story, and I'll try and do it in the form of a poem. Now this one, in American poetry, Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson are often referred to as the father and the mother of American poetry. That is, they're classic American poets who write on classic American themes, some of them very serious, and some of them very elegantly written, but in two different styles. So I thought it might be fun to put these two poets who never met in life into a poem together. Now the hometown of Emily Dickinson was Amherst, Massachusetts, and so this is a little poem called Amherst Clip Joint, in which I imagine Walt Whitman getting a haircut by Emily Dickinson. And it goes like this. Walt Whitman climbed up into Emily Dickinson's barber chair. She spun him round and then began by tossing his great hat aside and pulling back his wild hair. She twisted it into a ponytail and pinned it atop his bumpy head. Then she went to work on his beard, first with a pair of scissors and second with the electric clippers. He closed his eyes the way he did when he rode the ferry. The straight razor hummed up and down the strop. How many delicate strokes to unbeard a bard. You should have seen him preen in her lavender-framed mirror, turning his newly naked face from side to side and crooning, "You, madam, are an American Delilah. By you I am sweetly and utterly undone." To which she replied, "Look, Sam, that'll be 2 bits. Don't trip over the lilacs on your way out the door." At this he tossed back his head, opened his throat, and yowled like a coyote in heat. Oh, that man could yop with the best of them. Only Dizzy Gillespie, Joe DiMaggio, and Gary Cooper even came close. Call him a barbarian if you must, but he sat most daintily in Emily's chair that day, finally choosing a red lollipop instead of bubble gum from the big jar next to the cash register, and then skipping down Main Street sidewalk toward the town's only saloon. Some say that on a quiet day you can still hear the bell over the door clanging out his farewell. I know what you're going to ask. Yes, she slapped his cheeks gently with a little Old Spice before lowering his chair and shaking the whiskers from the striped cotton apron.
Very, very nice. Well, let's talk about, you have a book coming out. And there's a copy of the cover back here. Tell us about the book. How long did it take you to write it? I mean, what's in it?
Well, this one was a few years in the making. It's a collection of domestic poems, at least that's what I call them. Poems written more or less from the angle of my front porch, so I call it plebeian on the front porch. Plebeian, as you recall from the history of ancient Rome, was the average citizen, just the folks who would, like today, sit on their front porch with a glass of iced tea after work and relax. And they had very many average pleasures that the patricians, the upper class, kind of looked down on. And so in this book, I sort of see myself as an average citizen of Cupertino. And most of the poems are descriptions of interactions and observations with various wildlife, skunks and raccoons and deer and lots of squirrels and so
Like the
forth
beer
that show
park.
up, and just the various sort of neighborhood experience that we have here in suburban Cupertino. So it celebrates life here, and all of the poems in this little collection are a part of my little Cupertino domestic series, and that's coming out from Finishing Line Books.
And when will it be coming out?
It should be out in the springtime,
Oh, very nice.
so it'll be available online and from the publisher.
So we'll look forward to it. Okay, well, I think we're about running out of time. Is there anything else you'd like to add? How do they get in touch with you, or how do we know where you're going to be appearing?
Well, I'll be appearing and doing various cultural events and educational events at the public library throughout the next couple of years, and people can keep track of me. There's a link on the Cupertino.org website to my own particular website on Facebook. If you happen to be on Facebook, you can just go to Cupertino Poet Laureate, and I keep a record of all my events there and give people notice about when I'm appearing and what sort of things we're doing.
Well, thank you for joining us. I love doing the show. It just forces me into areas that I should be into, and I dug that thing out of the garage, and I'm going to donate that recitations newspaper to you and your students.
Thank you.
You'll most likely have far better use for it than I do, because it's rotting away in my garage.
Well, we'll take good care of it.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Phil.
Well, that's another issue of The Better Part. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you here again next week.